Hey fellas, Meat Trapper here. Welcome to another episode of Snare School. Today we're going to talk about how to hang a snare. We built our snare, we've talked about how to fasten it, how to anchor it. We talked about the parts of a snare. Now it's time to actually get out in the woods and support your snare. In order for your snare to make a catch, you've got to suspend the loop in the air in the path of the animal's travel somehow. Now there are a lot of different ways to hang a snare. Most of them are personal preference and dependent upon your location and environment. And I'm going to cover 5 or 6 different methods. These are not my inventions. These are all techniques that I've learned from others, and I'm just trying to pass them on. So let's get started. And hopefully this will show up on video, but there's a deer trail right through here. And I'm going to use this trail to demonstrate snaring a game trail. This tree right here is perfectly positioned, so I'm going to use that as my reference point, and every method that I show you is going to be set up in this same area right here. But hopefully you can see that. The first principle of hanging a snare is that a snare is usually a blind set. That means there's no bait, no lure. When you introduce bait or lure, you're going to alter the animal's gait and his speed of travel. He's going to go on the alert. You don't want that. You want the animal to just blunder into your snare and get caught and not realize that anything is wrong until it's too late. So we're going to set up as if this were a raccoon trail or bobcats we're walking at, or coyotes, or whatever we're snaring. But it's the off season, so I'm not going to leave them up. But let's get started. And this is going to be our location right here. Okay, the first method that we're going to cover is using my fiberglass pole. These are fiberglass electric fence posts. I buy them at Tractor Supply. They're 4 feet long. I cut them in half. So this is a 2-foot rod, and then I put a 9 or an 11 gauge wire on it. And I also have my snare coiled up and ready to go. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to push that into the ground, and I'm going to stick my support wire out here approximately over where the game trail is. The next step is I'm simply going to uncoil my snare, and this is my snare, my extension cable, my earth anchor, and my spring clip all in one. Before I set my loop or anything else, the first thing that I always do is anchor my snare. And you can see all I'm going to do is attach that to the tree right there. And I'm going to take and adjust my loop size for whatever species I'm going after. Let's say we're going to snare coyotes. So I'm going to put about a 10-inch loop here, and I'm going to take that support wire and insert it into my collar, and I'm going to adjust that right about there. There we go. Now you can see that took less than a minute to do. Insert the post into the ground, clip your snare to the tree, extend the support wire, and insert the support wire into the cable. Make your loop the proper size, make sure it's the right height, the right diameter, and you're done. That's the beauty of snaring. There's no digging, it's fast, it's simple. If somebody were to come along and steal this, all total, they may get $2 worth of material instead of a $30 or $35 trap. This is going to work even when the ground is frozen, even if snow falls. About the only thing that's going to put this out of commission is if ice forms on the lock so that the snare won't fire, or if a larger animal such as a deer comes along and knocks it down. If I should be unable to check this snare, what I can do is I can take this trap out of commission very quickly by simply pulling the snare off the support collar, closing the loop up. That's it. I can leave everything else in place and simply walk away from this set for a week, 2 weeks, and then when I want to come back and put this trap back into operation, all I'm going to do is open my loop back up and stick it back on my support collar, and I'm done. This is what the set looks like from the animal's perspective. You can see there's my fiberglass pole. You can see where it's anchored to the tree right there, and then you can see that loop. There's the support collar, and there's the loop right there, and you can see we're right up on this and it's almost invisible. Now you see why snaring is such a deadly method. I mean, this is very difficult to see. Now some people don't want to buy and carry fiberglass poles, which I understand that. You can get by just fine with a small coil of wire. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of wire, and this is 14 gauge support wire, and I'm going to attach it to the tree, and I'm simply going to make a support wire that comes out to hold the snare. So let's do this. Let's take about a foot of this wire. Let's cut it off. Now every time, and I've covered this before, every time you make a cut on wire, bend it over, make a safety bend. That way it doesn't poke your eye out. It's very important to keep that stuff bent over. Now what we're going to do here is we're simply going to take this wire and we're going to attach it to the tree like this. And you want to get it good and tight, twist it on there. Now you can see I can put that wire anywhere that I want. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little U-bend in it right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that U parallel to the line of travel. And then all I have to do is put the snare cable in there, adjust my loop to the right size, and then crimp that U tight so that it holds my snare in the position and at the height that I want. So that's about 10 or 12 inches worth of wire, and you can see that's solid, and I can put that anywhere that I want. Now here's a little bit better view of it. You can see I have crimped the wire to the tree, brought it down. Let's see if that will focus. There we go. Made a U, crimped it on there, and this will allow me to adjust the angle and the position of that snare. Now if I want to take this out of commission, pull the loop shut and pull it back out of the way. The snare is not going to catch anything, and it's going to be 10 seconds to put it back into operation if I want to come back a week later and put my trap back in a functional mode. So this is method number 2. This was a method that I learned originally when I first started snaring from Dan DeZarn, who was a snareman out of Kentucky, and had a great book, and he's the guy that got me started, and I'm eternally grateful to him. He was a heck of a guy. Now this method is what I call the split stick method, and with that you just take a knife, cut you a stick, and I pounded that into the ground just a little bit. Remember, this is just your support, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to make a little split right there. Now I'm going to take my snare, I'm going to adjust my loop, and I don't need a support collar, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to wedge that snare down in there like that. And at that point, that set is done. The main thing with this is more of what I would refer to as a field expedient or an emergency method. You're not going to have the control that you have with a wire. You also have to keep the loop fairly close to this stick. If you pull this cable out, you can see it's not gonna function 2 or 3 feet away. It's got to be fairly close to that stick in order for that loop to stay where I want it, because you don't have a lot of control right there. Now if you had some electrical tape, you could put a piece of electrical tape on there and firm that up a lot more. But like I say, the only time I'm going to use this split stick is if I've got a snare and I don't have any other way to support it. I'm out of wire, or I don't have a post or something like that. But this is a very practical field expedient method, and it requires virtually no materials other than the snare itself. We'll take a little closer look at that. You can see how that works right there. That's just a split that I put in the stick, and I've just wedged that snare cable right in there and then open that loop up to where I have it in the line of travel here. Like I say, that's a field expedient method. It's not my first choice, but I'll do that before I pass. One question that I get a lot is, what type of wire do I use? What gauge, what size, all of that. Your trapping wire comes in a number of different sizes. 16 gauge, which is just a utility tie wire, it's not really that useful. I consider 16 gauge to be too light. 14 gauge is what I was using when I was suspending the snare by the wire. 9 gauge is what I use for my beaver snares and what I use for my fiberglass posts. And from time to time I will use 11 gauge, but not often. 11 gauge to me is it's not heavy enough to be as stiff as number 9, and it's a little too heavy and too hard to work with compared to 14. So to me, number 11 is neither here nor there. But if you don't have the right size wire, you can improvise. For instance, if all you had was 16 gauge wire, or even just some light generic wire, what you can do is you can twist that wire together with a drill, and you can make a very stiff piece of wire. This right here is a piece of 16 gauge wire, which normally would be nowhere near stiff enough to support a snare. It would have too much flex and bounce in it. But as you're seeing right now, you can put this in the chuck of a drill bit and put the other end in a vise, twist it up, and make yourself a nice stiff snare. Now another thing that you can do, since this is stiff, instead of trying to wrap it all the way around the tree, one trick that I use is to use some fence staples. Now I always carry a pair of fencing pliers, and believe me, this is a great tool right here. These channel locks are awesome. So all I'm going to do is I'm simply going to start that right there. I'm going to put this in, and I'm simply going to hammer that in. There. Now you can see this isn't holding the animal. The snare is going to be held by my clip. All this has got to do is stick out over the trail so that I can put my snare on it. And once again, all I'm going to do is make my loop the correct size, get my support collar and stick that in there, bend that up just a hair, and I'm done. This is how you can take flimsy, cheap wire, twist it together to make a nice, stiff snare support, stick it into your support collar, and you're good to go. To me, this is extra work. It uses twice as much wire, so it pays to go ahead and buy what you need, buy the correct size, and stock up on it. Wire is cheap, but in a grid down situation, you may not have access to supplies, and if you come across other wire, it's a good thing to know how to improvise and how to make what you need instead of having to go to the store or go to the internet to get everything. So this is a trick right here. Double that wire up, make it plenty stiff, and then just put it into the tree with a fence staple. Okay, the final method that I'm going to show you today is sort of an all-in-one method. Some people will use a wooden stake. Some people use rebar. But basically what this is a stake that I'm going to drive into the ground. It's got a piece of number 9 support wire stuck through it. You can see that's crimped on, so it's tight. My snare is actually inserted and built onto the stake. You can see I've drilled a hole right through there. On the other side I've put a washer, and what that washer does is that allows that to swivel freely. And all I have to do is drive this stake, insert this stake into the ground. I've got my support wire, and the snare is permanently attached to it. Excuse me, I've got that whipped around the wrong way. But the snare is permanently attached to it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me get my fence pliers. You can see why I like these. They're very handy. So anyway, I've got my stake driven down into the ground. You can see the support wire is up. There's my snare. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make my loop. Get my loop to the right size. I've got my support collar here. I'm simply going to put that 9-gauge wire in there. Get a good tight fit. Let me open that. I want a little bit bigger loop than that. There we go. So I can put that exactly where I want it. So you can see there's my snare loop. There's the support wire. And you can see that support wire is down in the ground because it's in the bottom of that stake. The snare itself goes through the wooden stake all the way out. So when the animal comes through and gets caught, he's going to pull, and he's fighting, and he's going to pull that support collar off. And at that point, there's my built-in swivel. Let's see how that works. Now, of course, something like this, I believe this system was pioneered by, it was either Hal Sullivan or Bernie Behringer, I can't remember, but they were using it to snare coons. This is not something I would use to snare hogs or coyotes or anything like that. And of course, if you're in frozen or rocky ground, you're probably not going to be driving a wooden stake in the ground, but in an area that looks like this, a wooden stake is surprisingly sturdy. When you get it in there, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to start soaking up moisture from the ground, and it's going to swell. And the longer you leave that stake in there, the harder it's going to be to pull out. So that may not look secure, but for smaller animals, that's a very secure system. And this right here, like I say, it's an all-in-one. Everything, you got your swivel, your snare, your support wire, and your anchor. All you need is a hammer, and get out and go put that in. So people use this that are road trapping. That way they grab one thing and they go out and drive it in the ground. Well, fellas, that's a few ways to hang snares. I've used all of them, and they've all worked for me in the past. It's all going to depend on what you're trying to snare and what your area is, what type of conditions you have. But that's enough to at least give you some ideas and get you started. So I hope it was useful and worth your time, and thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.